All right. Well, welcome to 2023. I think it's going to be a wild year if any of that 23 lore that starts off with William Burroughs and goes into Robert Anton Wilson and the sort of underground psychedelic lore of the Discordian Society, et cetera, et cetera. If you're not familiar, give it a whirl, but you probably mostly are. This strange synchronistic power of the number 23 suggests that this might be a very peculiar year indeed. So we will see, and we'll try to keep our heads straight. I do believe that something between commitment to a meditation or contemplative practice, as well as a willingness to at least occasionally dive into the deep end of the psychedelic pool are some of the best things that you can do to prep yourself for the weirdness ahead, which is only going to get more peculiar and more destabilizing. I mean, I think just to take an obvious example, GPT chat and the sort of coming wave of AI, both in our cultural imagination and in reality and in the economy and in cultural production, is going to be just in its own, leaving aside all the other turbulences, itself will be quite a mind wringer. And I'd actually been not tracking the AI stuff for a long time, kind of intentionally. I was just like, I'm not going to go there. And then I read this book, Pharmaco AI, by this fascinating person who works at Google as an artist and as an AI theoretician. And they wrote this great book that using GPT-3 to sort of kind of explore its oracular and psychedelic dimensions. And so there's sort of part of the text is written by the AI and part of it is written by the author, Kedrick Alando McDowell. And it's a very interesting text. If you're at all resonating with any of the stuff I'm talking about, I highly recommend giving it a read. And Kedrick has a new book coming out that I'll be talking about, doing some events with them. And anyway, so the AI thing now, once I kind of made that move and all the stuff with the image generators, it's really just something's loose. It feels like a little proto singularity has struck, or like in William Gibson's The Peripheral, like some kind of event has occurred and now we're in a stub or something where like the AI is like active in a weird way. And so I'm just kind of tuned into that vibe. I have a predilection for that kind of thing anyway. But in any case, it also just, all of this stuff just intensifies and deepens my increasingly, in a way, ordinarian relationship with spirituality. I've noticed that over time, over the decades, I have come closer and closer to a kind of ordinary mind spirituality, despite my interest in ecstatic states and weird multidimensional realities and science fiction and Terence McKenna and tantric mysticism and gods and demons and ghosts and all of that kind of stuff that I've always loved and thrived in. The more honest I am about where my space, where the edge of my practice is it's more and more in the ordinary and the everyday, not just in the sense of like the banal, like it's though, although I think there's something very magical and very powerful about tuning into the banal, but more that tuning into the magic that is just everyday, weather, birds, body sensations, the awakened mind, the sense that magic isn't in some special place out there, but is available. And that one of the things that contemplative practice and meditation can do for you, as in addition to the sort of psychological things that it might help with, muting anger and reactivity, and opening up your heart, helping you work through some traumas or difficulties that are programmed in there, is that the capacity it has to simply freshen and brighten your ordinary mind in a way that makes a walk to the store a potentially, if not revelatory experience, then a scintillating one, something sparkly and alive and even synchronistic sometimes, a kind of gentle sense of grace imbuing the ordinary day. And I think that's a really important and powerful thing to do, because I increasingly kind of distrust the impulse which you find in psychedelic culture, and which as a sometimes psychedelic user I had definitely pursued, but this kind of drive for the peak, for these peak experiences. I think it's valuable. I think if you're into it, go for it. There's no reason not to, just the way there's no reason to not climb a mountain, or extend your orgasm for 3 hours long, or whatever you want to do, that unless you're also balancing that with a kind of embrace of a non-peak tendency, I think you can get stuck. And I think you could particularly get stuck in the world ahead. Because one aspect of the cultural evolution that we're already fully a part of, and in some sense has been going on for decades, if not centuries, but is now going to become more and more evident, is as brain science, virtual reality, psychedelics as an accepted strategy of cultural production, boredom, the degradation of physical reality, and the intensification of our urban environments, growing tension and difficulties, and psychological difficulties are going to put a lot of pressure on escapism. And man, I mean, the escapism ahead is, you think like, smoking a bomber and watching Netflix is escapist. Like just hold on to your seats, because it's really going to be good. And some of it's going to be spiritual. Like, I don't know how many of you have like poked around the sort of proto psychedelia of like Oculus, or the kind of VR worlds that are now commercially available, but they're like going for it. They're like, yeah, we can like bring it on. And, some of the psychedelic consumer tech prognosticators are talking specifically about how to bring psychedelics and VR together in order to intensify and organize and focus and probably program to some degree. Hopefully you're the one who's controlling the program to some degree. That all of that stuff is going to be very available. So if you have a sense that spirituality means peak experiences, there's going to be a lot of peak experiences to choose from. And we're going to want to check it out. It's going to be amazing. It's going to be fascinating. It's part of what it means to be alive at this point, to see what happens with this nervous system in the kind of extruded, post-human cyberdelic world that we're creating. But unless you have that ground, where the body and the ordinary mind and the flux of sensation and perception on a daily basis are also a kind of ballast, that unless you can develop that kind of ballast, I think it's going to be very easy to spin out. And so part of what we're doing here is kind of embracing that ordinary mind. And the way I want to spin that today is to bring in another element, which is this question of ancestral mind, which I mentioned in some of the promotion here. Like, what did I mean by that? Well, I use that word partly because I've been doing not my normal cup of tea, but I've been doing some ancestor work, which mostly involves thinking about what would it mean if I were, as part of my spiritual imagination, embracing the idea that part of the way we orient ourselves in sacred reality is through a relationship to the ancestors. And of course, as a white child of settler colonialists in California, riding the kind of fraying edge of the West, I have a very different kind of relationship to the ancestors than the relationships among indigenous folk or African Americans or people who are able to connect sometimes quite directly or at least indirectly to relatively near ancestors who don't have to be blamed for our current conundrum. And so even without getting into like whether the West is evil and this and that and all the kind of political tensions around the ideas of whiteness or European civilization or any of that kind of stuff, it's nonetheless the case that I think for many of us, the idea of the ancestors is kind of a bit flat. It's hard to access. And like, am I talking about like my weird grandpa who like worked for a bus company, was an alcoholic, and like, is that what we're talking about? And in a way, yes, it's partly about honoring the genetic line that you do come from and the people that actually made it through life enough to be able to set in motion the current that leads to your physical being and the gift of life. But there's something else that I've been sort of wrestling with and wanting to connect with. And so I've been going back, farther back, because somewhere back there's basically, somebody wandering the savannah with a small band of near family members, hunting and gathering. And what is that being like? What is my, what can I imagine about that person? Because it's so far away, and there's so much imagination and there's so little we know. Like, how can we really connect with that? And here I want to introduce an idea that stayed with me. I may have mentioned this before, but really one of my favorite books, and one you don't hear about very much, is this book by Morris Berman called Wandering God. And it's not perfect, it's eccentric, but it's pretty amazing. And there's a number of different elements to his argument, and some of which I won't go into here. But basically, he says that we have a sort of a misunderstanding about spiritual orientation that kind of has to do with what I was just talking about peak experience. And what he's saying is that because of the way civilization evolved, and even because of child rearing practices, he has a whole kind of peculiar anthropological argument about child rearing practices, which may be totally bullshit. I can't really tell, but it does have a certain logic to it. Is that like we in the West, let's say, are wired for ecstatic peak experiences. That's what our model of connection to the divine is. It's that we climb to the top of the pyramid, that all the action is on the top of the pyramid, up. It's all up. It's up in the face of God or the face of the mother, staring down unto the infant's eyes, absorbing all of that energy and all that attention. And he says, yeah, okay, that's the way we're wired now, but let's go back. Let's go back to imagine a Paleolithic environment. And he says, speculatively, but quite interestingly, he goes, that vertical axis is not really very meaningful when you're a hunter-gatherer. I mean, yes, you want to be able to look at the stars and you want to know what time of year it is and when the animals are going to move from here to there. And, you're completely immersed in the whole sensorium of nature, but that the consciousness that is appropriate to this mind is not one that seeks transcendence, that seeks ascent, but rather one that sort of paradoxically embraces the horizontal zone, the world that we're actually in, the nowness and all of its kind of complexity. And that sounds a little abstract. I'll give you a very concrete example from something that he doesn't talk about directly, although he alludes to it, but it was kind of like shortly after I was reading the book, I saw a Zen talk by a fellow who I didn't actually take to very much until he gave this talk, which has stayed with me almost more than any other Zen talk I've heard. And he was talking about, let's imagine ancestral mind. You have a small band of human beings who are clever, but very vulnerable, cruising along some savanna. There's some rocks, there's some trees, some rises, there's animals, megafauna, lion type things, saber-toothed tigers, whatever. There are serious predators out there. So what happens? Well, sometimes you got to stop, you got to chill out. You know, you got to let the kids hang out. You got to make the food. You got to grind the acorns, whatever you got to do. And somebody has to watch. Somebody has to keep watch. Well, how do you keep watch? You have a mind that is open, clear, undistracted, in absolute attention, that is neither grabbing a hold of any particular phenomena, but open to being grabbed by any particular phenomena. This is the paradoxical dimension that Morris Berman talks about. It's not like, you know, we imagine the kind of meditative state and we see it as this kind of zoning out, you know, this kind of sinking, or this kind of like checking out where you're so sort of internally focused. You're so sort of absorbed that you lose some of that crystalline sensitivity to what's happening in the external environment. That's a little bit of a caricature, but I know it as a meditator to some degree anyway. Like, I know that in meditation, I can bring my focus and my attention more and more internally, and kind of sink is maybe an overly, you know, loaded verb, but sink into myself and into a kind of trance, a kind of light trance of focus and absorption. Even that word absorption is often used among meditators to describe certain kinds of meditation. And some of the meditations we've done in this class are like that, where you're really kind of vibing into this kind of deep hum within which you become less distractible. So it's a perfectly legitimate route, but I think we tend to give less attention to this awakened, open mind, a kind of mind that's always ready for distraction. Not that it's going to grab you and grab your attention and become a true distraction, but that the environment around us, the field of sounds and smells, of shifts of light, even of events in our body, is all like up for grabs. It's always already part of the field. And that what that ancestral mind is doing is attending, but not checking out. It's attending to the space, to the environment, to the field, just waiting to see what arises. And a lot of time, nothing happens. But that nothing, you can't space out because you got kids there and there's megafauna out there. You have to stay awake. You have to stay attentive. So this is, you know, invited me to cultivate an aspect of sitting, which I don't do, you know, all the time by any means, but one in which I lean a little bit more into the external phenomena than you are usually sort of encouraged to do in a typical meditation regime, where maybe don't get distracted, you bring it back to your breath, you bring it back to sensations in the body. Maybe you do sound stuff. Sound stuff is kind of more along the lines of what I'm talking about. So if you worked with sound, with not grabbing a hold of things, but sort of recognizing sound as a kind of field that surrounds you and sort of attending to that spatial quality without grabbing specifics or even identifying specific sounds, you know, that's kind of more what I'm talking about. But I do think there is something to be said for really paying attention or allowing these external events to sort of announce themselves. And I keep putting it in scare quotes because one of the dimensions, and then I'll, then we'll try to work this out in a kind of another sandbox meditation where we're kind of talking about things as we're exploring the meditation itself. How to say it, but there's a way of leaning into the experience that breaks down the distinction between exterior and interior, such that the feelings in your body, maybe your belly grumbles, or even your breath is moving spontaneously, that these are really also just part of the field. It's part of the same field where the bus passes and birds cry and the light slants differently. It's just all part of the same external field that you're attending to. And even your distracting thoughts arise as if they were the cries of birds or the shadow of leaves across the ground before you. And so that's a way of kind of approaching even the internal environment, is that it's all environment, and that what's attending to the environment is more and more of a kind of mystery, an awake, attentive, present, spacious mystery. And so that's kind of what I mean by ancestral mind. And it gives me some sort of way of latching on to the kind of belief that somewhere in the ancestral line, this sort of, tawdry cavalcade of, cowboys and businessmen and violent soldiers and liars and thieves and all of the sort of characters that you can imagine litter one's personal line, that somewhere in there, there's an awake mind. Maybe it's not a monk, maybe it's not a mystic, but it is someone paying attention in the deepest and in a way most loving way you can imagine, which is to be completely open to what's happening and also always ready to respond. And that's the quality that's different than a lot of meditation instruction. So again, we're with our ancestor, and it might be all of our ancestors. We go back far enough. We're with our ancestor on that hill in that dusk, sitting open, quiet, undistracted, with as broad as 360-degree space of awareness as possible, especially vision, especially sound, but also sensations in the body. And there's an openness, there's a lack of distraction, there's a lack of fixing on sounds, and yet there's a little bit of readiness. There's a little bit of a trigger waiting, something that would respond instantly, spontaneously, immediately, out of the desire for safety and the desire for being aware of threats. And that's, again, something that we, I think, learn for very good reasons to kind of mute in meditation, where we're like less reactive, we're less responsive to external triggers. We don't care as much. Things can just happen, and even a very loud sound can happen, and we don't respond with a shock the way we normally do. So that's all signs of progress. But I think that on the far side of that, there's still something to be said, perhaps something even a little bit psychedelic, for leaning into the phenomena with an attentiveness and not quite an expectation, but a kind of waiting. There's a kind of waiting in the picture that is different than sort of settling and sinking or simply sitting. And that's kind of the edge I want to explore with the meditation, which is based on one of the first meditations we did in the earlier version of this class. So, but before I do that, I mean, just because I laid out this whole kind of story, which we can come back to, But if there's any kind of questions or clarifications or comments that are moving anybody right now, no big deal if not. Yeah, apparently there may be, oh yeah, oh no, now there's 26 participants. For a little while there was 23. Anyway, so let's do some sitting. Let's go on a voyage, see if we can explore this. So turn off your camera if it's probably easier. And settle in. Find your seat. Find your feet. You may be sitting in a chair, you may be sitting cross-legged, but let's start with the base of your body, where your body is touching the earth or the pillow or the carpet. Draw your attention to that connection and allow it to release as if you're settling into the earth. Perhaps you sense a kind of warmth or a buzzing as you release into that point of contact. Remembering that the earth supports. Feeling that support, that connection, which is always with us, always in the gravity well, always touching surface beneath us. As that warmth or vibration, allow it to rise, bubble up through your legs, into your midriff. Be aware of how your lower back is organized. Does it have that nice little tuck in it that allows your thighs and pelvis to sort of spill forward ever so slightly? So there's a nice curve in the lower spine, and feel that all as a kind of expression of the earth or of this contact of support, ever-present support. So now you have a really strong and settled base. If it's not quite right, shift around a little bit. It's okay. You're still settling in, but allow it to quiet and become supple and firm. Continue to rise now through the solar plexus and the chest. Noticing your breathing now. Don't try to do anything with the breath, just see it, greet it. Allow it to support this process of settling and awakening to the situation of your body here and now. Notice at the end of your breath, the sort of invitation to continue that process of settling, releasing and relaxing. Your hands, your arms, your shoulders, your chest, all of it settling, almost fusing, like the point of contact between your hands and your lap, or your butt in the chair, your feet in the floor. All of those points of contact are growing very melty, vibrational. They're humming. As your shoulders settle, again, make sure there's a little curve to your chest so that your shoulder blades are folding down the back, and the front of your chest is pulled forward ever so slightly without strain. So your shoulders feel like they can flow down the back and release the tension we carry there, at least some of it. There's always more. Even as you relax your shoulders, relax your chest, relax your thighs, notice that there's still a sense of tension, kind of presence there, and invite it to further relax, and also realize that there's only so far to go, usually. That's okay. That's part of what defines us, makes us mobile expressions of the earth rather than just slime molds, although slime molds are pretty cool. Finally, the head now, which hopefully feels poised and balanced on the spine. You can always encourage that by slightly tucking your chin, slightly tugging up the back of your head, like you're suspended on a single string attached to the upper back of your head. This helps elongate the spine and relax everything else. Particularly the muscles around the mouth, cheeks, jaw. Allow the jaw to open but maintain contact between the lips. Lots of energy around the eyes, but even if you normally sit with your eyes closed, try to make them half open or even more open, but find something that's comfortable, that's still relaxed. If your eyes are half open, there can be a way of doing this so that you're still sort of very internally focused, but I'd like you to kind of intentionally look or stare or be open to a surface or space outside your body. The wall in front of you, the carpet. Not looking at it tightly. Again, we're interested in relaxation in a spacious kind of 360-degree view, if we were able to have one, but have the orientation of the focus be outside rather than so relaxed that it kind of loses that sense of connecting to the environment. But otherwise, relax those muscles around the eyes and ears, scalp, so that we are at once held by the earth beneath us and by the beautiful architecture of our spine, and otherwise deeply relaxed. As you inhale, you might note where you're still holding tension, and without forcing it, see if something will release on the exhale. Part of this release is muscular, where you can allow the posture to hold you upright and release the kinds of tensions that we usually use to hold ourselves upright. But part of this release is also more subtle and energetic, even related to the personality. Don't worry about that. Just see where there's tension, where there's holding, and allow some release. No problem if nothing happens. It's like an onion. Now you may have noticed some distractions, thoughts, sounds, tensions or flutterings in the body. Simply notice them. Allow them to be there. Imagine then that you're sitting in a large clearing, a pasture, surrounded at its edge by trees and large rocks. Perhaps you are on a slight rise in this clearing, surveying the environment, the space before you. Nothing is moving, it is still. And yet, there are sounds, there are movements of the body, there are thoughts in the mind. But when you let them go, you return not to the breath, not even to the body, but to the clearing, the field within which everything is arising. So if you're used to returning to the breath, allow that to dissipate into a return to the sense that you right now are in an extended space, a multidimensional field within which sounds, lights, objects, sensations, and beings arise. And when you return from distraction, you are returning here to this radiant field. So let's sit with this for a few minutes. If you hear sounds or sense things moving, notice if your habit is to feel like these external signs are pulling you out of your meditation in the spatial sense, as if sitting and quieting were an internal process, something happening inside the body or inside the spirit, inside the body. And then the external world of sounds and lights, of movements, even of shifts of the body, are somehow distractions out of the space. Instead, I'm suggesting that we are already in the field. We are already in the clearing, three-dimensional, spacious, extending infinitely, and that everything that's arising is arising in that field. It's not pulling you anywhere. You're already there. So even as you notice a distracting sound, simultaneously allow the sound just to be there, just to arise, briefly abide, and dissipate. No need to reject or even forcibly drop. Simply notice its appearance and disappearance. If you're distracted by feelings in the body, the same thing. They're part of the same field. They're not taking you in or taking you out. They're just arising, abiding, and passing away. Even thoughts are like this, though that is a tricky one because they're so sticky and so compelling. But they too are simply events in the field. So sometimes, even if you notice a thought enough to be captured by it, somewhere in that instance, there's a sense of space or a sense of it arising. It's subtle and difficult, but in some ways it is simply like noticing that the crow is cawing. The mind stream is thinking. Notice what your eyes are doing. Perhaps your eyelids have closed. Perhaps the half lids are getting pretty fuzzy. So try to open your eyes, not entirely if that seems discomforting, but to allow more light in, maybe more than you normally do sitting. Be aware if you're grabbing towards individual objects, and see if you can soften your gaze. Not to render everything a big mush, but to allow the relations, the way things occupy space, to take precedent over their objectness. In the clearing, it is like seeing the curves along the edge of the trees, or the shapes and spaces made by the rocks, rather than simply looking at the rocks themselves. But they make a good shelter. Where are the gaps? How does the space itself compose itself? So in this clearing, this field, we're allowing thoughts and objects and impressions to arise and just be in this ecology of forces. Remember or consider that there is something alive in all this, something that is not you, an animal, a spirit, a creature. You can't see it, but you know or suspect that it might be there. And how does that knowledge or that suspicion change your relationship to this field? Amidst the sound of the traffic, can you hear the movement of a beast? Between the objects in your ordinary room is something fluttering. No reason to feel fear, no reason to be paranoid. But allow that possibility to shift the field. Even as you relax, there's an alertness, and that does not need to be a distraction. The alertness too is a mode of awareness and awakening. Can your mind be alert and soft at the same time. Another concept might help here, which is that as human beings, we are extraordinarily likely to rest on inertia, and especially the inertia of our expectations that the next moment will be more or less like this. And that as we settle and relax into meditation, a kind of sameness or consistency can be something we rely on, even enjoy. And yet, as we settle into this sort of timeless time, remember that we really have no idea what the next moment is like. None. It becomes interesting again. Another kind of alertness perhaps comes. Okay, let go of any image, any orientation, and we will end the meditation here.